know I've spoken about this topic multiple times in Sacramento, so I appreciate the folks who have familiar faces and some new faces to talk about this. This is a project that we've been working on for many years. I'll just sort of let you advance to the next, just to our acknowledgement. This is partly we've been working on it for many years because we got a very large grant from the U.S. Department of Education, who really wanted to understand the impact of California's early assessment program and also its mechanisms. And so we want to thank them, as well as some seed money from the Gates Foundation and the Spencer Foundation. But more, I really want to thank for folks here who work in the state agencies, how hard it is to work across agencies. And so I really want to acknowledge, in particular, Beverly Young, who's here from the Cal State University system. This project would never happen without her coming to one of my early talks that just used a little bit of data and said, I think you should look at this for the whole responsible. And then also Deb Sigmund and Rachel Perry, when they were at the California Department of Education, were really good partners in being able to bridge the CSU data with the K-12 data. So I just want to acknowledge them. And then obviously the EAP was extended to the community colleges, and we're going to talk about a little bit about that today too. And some folks there also were very willing to play along with us and help us match even additional data. And then finally, I work closely with a couple other colleagues who used to be in this area. Jessica Howell was a faculty member at Cal State Sacramento, and then moved on. She's now Director of Research and Policy at the College Board, and Eric Grotsky, who left UC Davis for University of Wisconsin. Okay, so today we're going to try and do a lot because, as David said, we want to basically talk about work that we've been doing for several years. That last time I presented, I talked about sort of initial results on the statewide results on the impact of the EAP, and I'll talk about them again today. But also, we really wanted to spend some time around why we saw the results we saw, and we're going to try to unpack some mechanisms for you. So to preview the findings, we do find that the EAP has led to a reduction in the need for college remediation at CSU, and to some modest extent at the community colleges, and I'll talk about that because it's a very different population. But we also wanted to understand why we might see the results that we see, and so Jake is going to spend a lot of time, because a lot of it was his research in particular, on trying to unpack the mechanisms, in particular on why we saw the reduction. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll also talk about some future research that we're engaged in, and in particular I wanted to at least spend a little time on the research we did with the community college system as well. So moving ahead, I probably don't need to motivate for this audience, but just to remind you why we even developed the EAP, not we, but do we have the EAP, and why do we care about college readiness? And that's partly because at the non-selective four-year system, and CSUs can be, some are broad access, some are moderately selective, but overall we know system-wide that there's both a really high rates of remediation need at the Cal State University system. As many as 2/3 of students need remediation in either English or math. I have the patterns here. You'll see a drop here, and that's partly, that'll circle back to our very ending slides about future steps, and that's partly because of early start, and I'll mention that at the end. But despite reductions in remediation need, we still have very, very high rates of students entering college not ready for college level work. We also, I just want to note, we're also particularly focused on college readiness and developmental course taking, because we think it has important, research has shown it is highly correlated to completing college. And the completion rate at CSU also just hovers at around 50+%, and that's something the system is very, very concerned about and is working. I'm actually working with them a lot on the sort of graduation initiative work, and it's to improve the 6-year completion rate and even the 4-year completion rate. Also just want to note that both completion rates and college readiness rates vary tremendously by background. This is the racial ethnic differences in the percent of students requiring remediation at CSU, and so we'll see that much higher rates for underrepresented minority groups. And there are lots of reasons for this, not just testing differences, but also access to quality K-12 schooling. There's lots of other research that we've done and others have done connecting the impact of sort of school, individual demographics and college readiness metrics. Another thing I wanted to show to motivate, which I haven't shown and I think will interest this audience, is sort of that motivates why we might have needed a statewide assessment to look at college readiness. This is statewide data on high school GPA is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is readiness, that is entering college, ready to do college level work. And so you'll see overall, no surprise, we see high school GPA is a good predictor of, on average, of being ready to do college level work. That is, students who are up here at, on average, if you look at the red line, who are at sort of a 4.0 or above, have higher than sort of 80% likelihood of being ready for college. But you'll also hopefully see this incredible amount of variation across the state in the relationship between high school GPA and college readiness. And then I just wanted to show you what, go ahead, sorry, we don't have a clicker. But then I also wanted to show you how much this is dependent at the school level. And so what you have here are two schools, School A and School B. And so you'll note that in School A, regardless of whether you have a pretty low GPA, your college readiness levels are much, much higher than if you're in the screen School B, where even students who exit high school with a 4.0 are only about 40% likely to be ready for college level work. So we have tremendous amount of variation school-wide in college readiness as predicted by high school GPA. And I think speaks to this sort of potential need for both an assessment and also for thinking about how to raise college readiness across all schools, but in particular at schools where high school GPA is not a very good indicator for the post-secondary system on who's ready for college level work. All right, so the goals of the EAP program, and I will just sort of remind you, was developed in 2004 as a collaboration with the CSU system and the Department of Ed and the State Board of Ed as a sort of, I think, pretty revolutionary collaboration between post-secondary education and K-12. We don't see that a lot, not only in California, but anywhere. I think got a lot of attention nationwide because of this. And it was the goals of the EAP were to provide an early signal to students about their college readiness. And I'm going to say it here and I'll say it again. Our work is really going to mostly focus on the testing component, or not mostly, exclusively focus on the testing component. But there are other very key important aspects to the program. And so I will just already tell you that I'm going to say EAP when I mean really just the assessment component. But I'm going to say something about these in just a second. So the goals of the AP were to sort of improve college readiness statewide and to do it early. And again, the early assessment program, is in 11th grade. We might all kind of question now whether that's early enough, but it was early at the time, and it was already much earlier than anybody else was doing it, which is, in other words, when students enter, which we think is definitely a little too late. So the three components of the program is this 11th grade testing, which is the focus of our work. But just really quickly, I want to say there are two other really important parts of the program, the early assessment program. And one is this professional development for teachers. And so what was kind of revolutionary about what CSU did is it didn't just create an assessment to give students signals about their college readiness, but it also had faculty and CSU leaders really want to work with high school teachers around what they mean by preparing students for college. And so I just want to shout out to Nancy Brittleson here, who was kind of the chief architect of that in the English portion, which is in the expository reading and writing. And I talked to her recently only because the federal government also gave them a grant to better understand the impact of the professional development component of the EAP. And so we trust that she'll sort of report to us on that. But the preview is it's proving to have a positive impact on students who had exposure to teachers who had this professional development relative to students who did not. The other key piece of this, which often doesn't get discussed, is that students, once they get the signal from the 11th grade testing around whether they're ready or not ready for college, we're also given additional guidelines around sort of or guidance about what they could do to better prepare. So you'll see in a slide in a minute, most students who were involved in the EAP, which quickly became all California 11th grade students, were not ready for college. In other words, the signal they got was that they weren't quite exempt from needing additional, at least assessment, if not coursework in 12th grade. And so CSU invested heavily in providing a website and other materials of directing students with what they could do between when they got this assessment and when they entered college. And we're not going to spend time on evaluating that because we don't have an easy way to evaluate the portion of that, but it's important to know that EAP was kind of a package of all of these things. And the part that we're evaluating is really just the 11th grade testing. Okay, I think So the 11th grade testing. So the 11th grade testing was an augmentation to the existing California state tests, augmented in that it added additional 15 questions on the 11th grade CST. Those questions were developed in partnership with CSU faculty around good metrics for what we would tell us if students were ready for college. And that score, importantly, is not just on those 15 questions, but it's on the 15 questions in addition to the CST, what the questions on the CST. And the potential college readiness signals that students received in the spring of their 11th grade year was in a letter that said either they were ready, that is, and what does that mean? They were exempt from needing to take remedial courses at CSU, and really they're exempt from an assessment that would tell them if they needed to take. In other words, when they enter CSU, they don't have to do any additional assessment related to their potential developmental course taking. Or they were not exempt. That is, when they show up at CSU, they're going to have to take an assessment test that would tell CSU if, in fact, they needed additional developmental course taking or not. Or they could be conditionally exempt. So for quite a few years as just in math, and the conditional exemption in math basically told students that they needed to take an additional Algebra 2 or higher level course in the 12th grade and get a C or better in it, and then they would be exempt. And in English, which, what year did English conditional exemption come about? About 3 or 4 years, is a little bit different in that there also was a course that students could take to meet the exemption, but it's not just any course. It was a particular course that uses this expository reading and writing program that I referred to. And so that's smaller in numbers because of the number of courses available, but growing in over time. In other words, more high schools have exposure to this 12th grade English course now than they did when it first started. So here's what the latest, well, I should say not the latest, the 2013 EAP test results when we still had the CSTs, when the CSTs were still mandatory. And so you'll see, and this has improved a little bit over time, but very little, I should say. I didn't show you the trend here, but it has varied a little bit. So you can see in math, an important thing I need to report is that in math, you aren't eligible to even to participate in the EAP portion unless you're at Algebra 2 or higher. And so we have quite a few that aren't eligible. Quite a few 11th graders aren't eligible to participate in the math. Among those that did participate, 18% were deemed not ready, 21% were conditionally ready, and 7% were ready. In English, we had a little more didn't participate in 2013, but I think that's because maybe, I don't know, this surprises me a little bit. I'm just looking at Jake because we just added this year of data, because one of the things we do notice since 2004 to when CST stopped being used is that we got to nearly universal participation rates in the English EAP. So actually this makes me think we're not using the year in which CST was
this is the last one, and the denominator there is all kids took the CST.
Right. Yeah, so this seems a little bit high to me. But anyway, 51% were not ready, 12 were conditionally ready, and 19 were ready. And the English, I should say, the English has, again, in prior years, got to about 21% ready, whereas about 22 even is ready. Yeah, please.
When you do math, do they have to have already completed Algebra 2, or can they be taking Algebra 2?
They could be taking Algebra 2. Yep, great. Anything else? Okay. Great. So let's just, first I'm going to try as quickly as I can so we can get to the new stuff, kind of tell you what did we learn from evaluating the impact of the EAP. Okay, so the questions we asked were, how does participation in California's early assessment program affect a student's probability of requiring coursework in college? And then, does the EFFECT program differ for different types of students? That's the questions we're going to try and answer. And let's just answer the first one first. We're going to use CSU Chancellor's Office data. So they very generously gave us 6 cohorts of first-time freshman applicants from the years before the EAP came on board to years after. And you're wondering why these look data, and that's partly because we don't have a randomized experiment here. In other words, we can't sort of determine the counterfactual for a student who didn't have access to the EAP, what would have happened. And so we're going to try and simulate that by looking at cohorts of kids before EAP came on board and compare them to cohorts of kids after. We're going to match the CSU data on college readiness with data from the California Department of Education, which actually owns the EAP data because it was a 12th grade assessment, 11th grade assessment. So it's happening in K-12. And we're going to match the applicants and enrollees. So we have access also to not just who enrolls at CSU, but also anyone who applies. And we're going to match CST scores, EAP participation, and then a whole bunch of other student and school characteristics. And again, this is kind of what I was suggesting. The intuition is that we need to create a counterfactual. So what we really want to answer is sort of two questions. What happened to California's college-going students in terms of college readiness as a result of the EAP? And that we're going to think of as a sort of intent to treat. So California created this policy. I actually failed to mention an important thing, which is that the EAP was voluntary to students. They didn't have to participate. Though in more recent years, it became nearly universal participation. And so what we want to know is, well, in an intent to treat model, how did this policy, this introduction of this new way to determine college readiness, what did it do to college readiness? And this is a really important question for the federal government and for other states that want to know, okay, you introduce this new assessment, and some people take it and some people don't. Well, what happens when you do that? And so that's the intent to treat model, where we're not going to really, we care that some people participate and some people don't, but we actually want to build that into the model because we expect if a state wanted to introduce a new assessment program that was voluntary, they actually want to know, well, what can they expect might happen? And so the intent to treat is actually equally as important as the, go ahead to the next one, the treatment on treated, which is, okay, some students got this signal on their college readiness. Well, what can we learn about how that signal influenced their college readiness? And so we're also going to look at the impact of participating in this assessment component of the EAP. That is, what happens for some students who got the signal on whether they were ready or not, and compare them to students who didn't. And to do that, we do need to worry about the fact that there's what we would think of as selection. If you're at a school where people weren't participating, the school didn't want to include the EAP as part of the 11th grade testing, we might worry that that school and the students in that school might differ from students in a school where everybody was required to participate. And so we do lots of different things and lots of papers, and we won't bore you with all the specifications, but we're going to show you the most rigorous of our specifications, which is we're going to take a subset and really test whether our results hold in schools where there's 90% of students participate and compare them to schools in the pre-EAP cohort. In the paper, we do lots of other stuff. Okay, so here are the results. This is the intent to treat, and so we are comparing here the probability of needing remediation when you enter CSU in English and in math, and you'll see that it's about 1.8 percentage points, or 2 percentage points in math. And this is just the intent to treat. So regardless of whether you participated or didn't participate, we see that the EAP was associated with a reduction in state overall remediation rates of about 2 percentage points in English and in math. What about those who actually participate? Well, we see slightly bigger. We would expect that because now we are adjusting for the fact that they get the signal. And we see in English a 2.2 percentage point decline in remediation rates overall, and a 2.7 percentage point decline in math. Okay. Before I get to how does this differ for different students, I just want to say, some of you might think, sort of, well, how big is this? Like, what's the magnitude of this kind of change? How might you think about it? And so we've estimated, sort of, in a typical freshman cohort, we're talking about several thousands of students who are now more likely to be ready, given sort of a typical freshman cohort of entering CSU system-wide. I also just have recently some conversations, and sort of, you can think of these as modest positive effects because they seem small, but for folks who kind of read and understand education intervention effects, I like to sort of say California has tried many things, including massive class size reductions and other things that didn't necessarily materialize. This is still pretty big differences by education standards, reducing. It's quite difficult to tackle remediation rates in general, college readiness as a concept. And so we think these are actually pretty substantial compared to other policies in this area. Okay, well, what about whether the program differs for different students? And we've sliced this I'll tell you, we don't have slides on it, so I'll tell you we don't find any important differences by race and ethnicity. That is, the program's effects seem to function similarly for students from different racial ethnic backgrounds. There's some modest differences by gender, but they actually don't hold up in different specifications, so we don't actually think they're, they might be there, but they're not big if they are there. Where we do see important differences is by prior achievement. And so this is a kindly, let me break down this graph, which looks a little bit complex. And so here's the red line is at 0, and that's if we found no effect of effective EAP on remediation rate. We're looking for negative numbers because remember it's remediation rates, and so we want them to go down. So you saw the negative reduction by about 2 percentage points. And so that's what we're looking for. And so we're looking at this blue line, and these are just confidence intervals around the line. And where you really see the EAP effect is over here. And that's for students with less likelihood of needing remediation to begin with. And so the program's effect really focus on students who are close and just need the boost. And by that I mean students who aren't really far from being ready, high rates of likelihood of needing remediation, but students who really are more at the bubble of college readiness, where this signal is going to push them to the other side. So the effects are really concentrated, and this is for English, and we find the same thing for math. And so this is just, again, just as in the previous graph, differences in the effects by 11th grade remediation need. And we sliced 11th grade remediation need in lots of different ways. You can use CSTs, you can use high school GPA, you can do a lot of different things, but really the effect is on overall the likelihood of needing remediation to begin with. The EAP seems to really benefit students who are really close to college readiness, but not quite there. Okay. So summary of the overall effects, and then we're going to sort of tell you about the mechanisms, is that the EAP policy, that is the introduction of the policy, led to a modest reduction in the probability that CSU freshmen require remediation. EAP participation leads to a modest 1 to 2 percentage point reduction in the probability that CSU freshmen require remediation, and that the program had larger effects for students who were less likely to need remediation. And we really wanted to tease out where these results were coming from, and so we also wanted to try to understand if they were functioning through the school and other unintended consequences that might come about. And without spoiling Jake's portion, I'm going to turn it over to him.